You made the provocative observation that, it's often said that a girl who grows up with a father who cheats on her mother or just leaves the family at some point, she's more likely to become promiscuous herself because she grew up with that kind of father figure. And you made the observation, you know, the genes here have a lot to say. The fact that her father had the types of genes that make him more risk taking and promiscuous might have been transferred to his daughter. So provocative, but something to think about.
Well, and actually, there are twin studies and adoption studies showing that divorce itself, most people think of that as an environmental measure. But now you just say, what about genetics? And as you're saying, divorce, it isn't just something that happens to you, obviously. You're in a relationship with someone, you get married. What makes some people get divorced and others not? Well, it could be shit happens, but it could also more likely be, relations grow and they fall apart and people grow differently. And the thing I wonder about, and some evidence backs this up, is having been divorced 3 times myself, I can sort of speak to this, and that something that traits that make you attractive in a mating situation, like you're saying, sort of risk taking away, but spontaneity, joie de vivre, maybe that doesn't translate very
Right.
to long-term relationships. So it may be the very things that genetically make you a good prospect, make you a bad partner. It could be. But there is some evidence for that personality traits of risk taking, extroversion, activity level, energy, you're just interesting, right? And I remember when I was growing up, I found women who were kind of crazy interesting. And again, people who are kind of nuts are very interesting. You notice them, you know, but you can imagine there that is not very predictive of a good long-term stable relationship.
Right. I always thought of novelty seeking as something that makes monogamy really difficult. I have friends who I can really tell they're high in novelty seeking. They love change. Like to go with the flow. They don't like to make plans. They like to be spontaneous. And I have friends who, they love to make plans. And if something is familiar, they like it better. And I think that, that trait itself would make monogamy considerably, more difficult if you're high in novelty seeking. And at some point, um, the initial novelty and excitement of the relationship wears off and you're in that familiar, intimate zone. Someone who's not geared towards that will be more difficult, for sure, for sure. Moving into personality, which I would love to talk a little bit about because, as you said, personality is at least 40% heritable. And there's talk, whether or not personality is genetic, whether we can change our personality, whether an introvert can become an extrovert. And what I've always thought is that we really are born with our temperament and our personality. And what we do have control over, I like to call character development. If you're an introvert, you can work on your social skills, but you're never going to be like an extrovert who just gets a dopamine hit from, being around a lot of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And that's fine. We're all adapted for certain things. But understanding that our personality really is, deeply ingrained, it has to do with our physiological wiring. It makes us perceive the world differently. It makes us react to situations differently. And there's a big, big genetic component. So,
Mm.
what have you found in terms of, personality traits, whether it's the Big Five or Eysenck, for anyone who's not familiar, the extroversion, psychoticism, and neuroticism? What have you found are the most heritable traits?
Right. Well, that was the question that got me started in genetics. I um, worked with mice when I first went to graduate school because they're very powerful. They have these inbred strains of mice and selected lines of mice. And you can manipulate the environment, manipulate the genome in a way. So very powerful techniques, but like about 50% of the people who work with mice, I developed a severe allergy to them because in those days, in the 70s, it was before health and safety. And I, as a graduate student, was consigned to literally a closet where I was breeding these mice,
Oh my.
no ventilation. And it's now thought that maybe 25% of the population would develop an allergy given that intense exposure to mice, which have this dander as part of the pheromones that they communicate with. And it's very powerful in create, well, they don't create allergic reaction, but if you have any vulnerability at all to that sort of allergic response, you'll get it if you work with them in that situation. So then
Right.
in my
Interesting.
year in
Interesting.
graduate school, then I say, well, what am I going to do now? And so I was interested in behavioral genetics because I went to the University of Texas at Austin, which was the only place in the world at that time that had a course in behavioral genetics, just to show you how environmentalistic psychology was in those days. And I was floored by it, you know. I just thought, God, it's so powerful. And how is it possible I never heard about genetics in my psychology undergraduate degree? So I was keen on it. And I was interested in personality. I was working with someone, Arnold Buss, who studied personality and its relationship to psychopathology. And so I thought, what would be cool is to get away from self-report questionnaires, which is basically how we measure personality. And to think, because I was interested in development, what about young kids? Well, the neat thing about young kids is you can't give them personality questionnaires. You have to study them by observing them. You can ask their parents to rate them. You can ask daycare teachers to rate them. So you get a completely different way of approaching the problem. And what we found from that early research on temperament, temperament is often thought of as early appearing, that is early developing personality traits. And these aren't your sophisticated traits of uh, psychoticism, you know, dealing with basic sort of animal differences of personality. Did you see in all mammals, for example?
Right. Like reactivity and approach and avoidance and things like that.
Yes. So I was interested in asking whether those things would be more heritable than later personality traits. And after 10 years of research, I think we conclude no, they're heritable. And it's interesting, they're heritable early in life. For example, the most heritable trait very early in life in infancy is shyness. And even though we think of kids, you know, in the first year or so of life or at 2 years of age, you know, when a stranger comes, they hide behind their mother, you know, so all kids they go through phases of being more or less shy. But if you see enough kids, you realize huge differences in shyness. Like I observed twins in their homes at 15 months of age. And, you know, it's really quite striking. I would try to go in a standard procedure, and we had a guy videotaping as well behind me. It's just amazing how some of those kids, they hid behind their mother the whole time I was there for like an hour and a half. Whereas other kids, they immediately come running up and they're jumping on you, you know? So it's really quite striking
Right.
how different kids are, even very early in life, which is kind of important because that reinforces this notion I said about parents being environmentalists until they have more than one child. You know, you really do, when you're looking at twins, you really do see those differences, you know, and especially with fraternal twins who are 50% different genetically. So temperament is a thing that is personality differences early in life. They're heritable, but not much more heritable than other personality traits later in life. So altogether then, most personality traits are heritable, and you can find evidence for a bit more heritability for the traits Ising studied, extroversion and neuroticism. And neuroticism there doesn't mean being neurotic. It just means emotional lability. You know, some people are are just more labile, not just in terms of fear, but even in terms of anger. You know, that you just have a more up and down sort of
Right.
system.
Volatility.
Volatility is exactly the word. That's right.